with loneliness. So I've got a few quotations and then we'll have the scripture reading. Mother Teresa said that the most terrible poverty is loneliness. And the 17th century poet John Milton said that loneliness is the first thing God's eye named not good. And God said, it is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper as a partner. The writer Pearl Buck said that the person who tries to live alone will not succeed as a human being. His heart withers if it does not answer another heart. And then an anonymous woman, I've got everything I need except a man. And I'm not one of those women who thinks a man is the answer to everything. But I'm tired of living alone. So now let's look at the scripture. 1 Corinthians 7, page 161 in the Pew Bible. 1 Corinthians 7, page 161, and we'll read verses 8 to 10, or verses 8 and 9, and then we'll also read from verse 25. Or perhaps we'll go to verse 7. But each has a particular gift from God, one having one kind and another a different kind. To the unmarried and the widows I say that it's well for them to remain unmarried as I am. But if they're not practicing self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to be aflame with passion. And then in verse 25, now concerning virgins I've no command of the Lord, but I give my opinion as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think that in view of the impending crisis, it's well for you to remain as you are. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you marry, you do not sin, and if a virgin marries, she does not sin. Yet those who marry will experience distress in this life, and I'd spare you that. I mean, brothers and sisters, the appointed time has grown short. From now on, let even those who have wives be as those who had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no possessions, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. For the present form of this world is passing away. I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the affairs of the Lord, how to please the Lord, but the married man is anxious about the affairs of the world, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. And the unmarried woman and the virgin are anxious about the affairs of the Lord, so that they may be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about the affairs of the world, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to put any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and unhindered devotion to the Lord. So, Paul's reading, I think, is remarkably different from the quotes that I gave earlier on the screen. And essentially, Paul is saying that singleness is best. And often in our situations we will say what we are like is best. If you're a kind of a farmer, you'll say the rural life is best. If you're a kind of a cafe person, you'll say city life is best, and so on. And here's Paul, and he is a single person, although some suggest that he may well have married earlier, because it was pretty well universal for expectation for every Jewish male to marry. So he may have become a widower, but anyway, he's a single person, and he says that singleness is best. Now, I'm aware that singleness can happen in various ways in relation to marriage, and some are never married, and there are others where there is a broken marriage and there is divorce, and in other cases there is a death and a person is a widow or widower. And all of us are very likely to be significantly single at some point in our adult lives. And so the question arises, if we take Paul's comments, why may singleness be best? And here are three answers. One is that singleness can be a gift. Now, sometimes people think about spiritual gifts, like healing and prophecy and speaking in tongues. The same word is used here of very ordinary things. And marriage can be a gift. And Paul says singleness also is a gift. Sometimes people have a calling which is all-consuming. Mother Teresa would be an example. I think that the great evangelical preacher John Stott, who was single throughout his life, is another example. And it is much better for those people if they totally are able to express their calling, and marriage is a gift. And some people are wired in a way that singleness is best for them. And I think it's very important to underscore that singleness can be a gift, because so often we make marriage the model. And anybody who is not married is somehow second best or inferior or something like that. Some single people are the most wonderful people in the world, and some single Christian people are the most serving people in the world. Marriage can be a gift. And another reason that Paul puts forward why singleness may be better is that singleness can be better in times of hardship. You may have noticed that odd verse in verse 26. He says, I think that in view of the impending crisis, it's well for you to remain as you are. There is a scholar, Bruce Winter, and he's kind of looked into the background of that statement. And it's fairly clear the time that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, and what he's identified is that there was a very, very major famine in Corinth and that part of the world at that time. And we can just blithely talk about famine. In ancient famines, people died. It was very difficult to move food from one place to another. If crops failed in one area, then death was there. And it makes sense that in a difficult situation, it may be better not to load things onto a spouse, and it may be better not to have children. It strikes me with relation to our daughter Julie. She could not easily be there as a married person with a family. It's in those single situations that people can go into places of hardship. And a third reason why Paul suggests that marriage is better is because single people are freer to focus on Jesus and are freer to focus on Christian ministry. And in verses 32 to verses 34, Paul talks about being free from anxieties and clutter. And the single person is less cluttered and can provide a spiritual focus. I think to times when I feel that God has particularly spoken to me. And usually those times are in times of temporary singleness. Now, Shona doesn't like me to say this, as if she's a hindrance. But the reality is that when you are on your own, you can kind of focus in better. And I think of times when I'm tramping, and I think of times when I've been hitchhiking on my own, and times like that, and feel that God has spoken to me. And I find as a pastor that elderly single people who have a lot of time on their own have often they are wonderful prayers. And that is a wonderful gift. They can focus on God. And those single people who can focus on Jesus and on Christian ministry, they have a wonderful opportunity. So in Papua New Guinea, a missionary team of about 10 or a dozen adults, and the best one in the missionary team in terms of winning people for Jesus was Helen Held, a woman of about 60, much older than the rest of us, but single and going into pioneering situations. And she was the catalyst for the whole Asherim village turning to Christ, which was kind of a wonderful story because of that singleness. Now, I just want to go to another reading. If you just put that up, Shona. And this is from 1 Corinthians. The unmarried man is anxious about the affairs of the Lord, how to please the Lord. And then from the First Secretary General of the United Nations, Dag Hammarskjöld, who was both single and a Christian. And he said, "Pray that your loneliness may spur you into finding something to live for, great enough to die for." Okay, now one of the things that strikes me is that there seems to be a bit of a clash between what Paul says and the first quotations that I put up on the screen. And yet I don't think there was a clash, because what Paul was speaking about was singleness, and what the quotes was talking about was loneliness. And Paul, I think, was not primarily a lonely man. He was a single man, but you'll notice that he went around with a team. There were always other people with him. So there was Barnabas, for example, John Mark, Luke, Timothy, Titus. We could come up with other names as well. So there was a sense of teammanship. And one of the things that strikes me in terms of today's world was that in the past there was much more community than there is now. I think, for example, of my father's family. My father was one of 14 children, believe it or not, 14. And 3 of them never married. One man, my Uncle Alan, and 2 aunties, Edna and Joan. And they lived with each other, and they lived with my grandmother, who was a widow for 30 years. And so although they were single, there was community for those single, unmarried men and women. I think of my mother's family. She was only one of only 6. And in that situation, one didn't marry. And she lived with my grandparents and then with my grandfather. When he eventually died, she went to live with a brother and his wife. And then when he died, she went to live with an auntie who had become a widow. And there was a community all that time, despite being single. In today's world, you tend not to live with your parents if you're single, once you get to a certain age. And you go flatting. And some flats are good, and they have a bit of community to them. Some of them, I think, they're kind of dreadful. And there's no community at all. And each one might have a television set in their own room. They spend their time there. And there's no communal cooking. And maybe you kind of scuttle into the kitchen, or maybe you don't even use the kitchen, and you take your meal to your room, and so on. And so people, I think, for various reasons, are facing far greater loneliness today, just because people are so solitary. And I think sometimes people are getting into wrong sexual situations, and the driver is not necessarily lust, but the driver comes out of that loneliness. Now, there's 2 further quotations that I want to put up on the screen. One says this: "What should young people do with their lives today? Many things, obviously, but the most daring thing is to create stable communities in which the terrible disease of loneliness can be cured." And then from Psalm 68, "God sets the solitary in families." When we become Christians, it is not just me and God, or me and Christ, but it's us together in community with Christ. And What I think has often happened is that we have our families, perhaps our marriages if we're married, as I am, and that is a privilege. And one of the important things for those of us who have a community, particularly a marriage or a family, is to share that marriage and that family with other people. Sometimes it's other people living in, sometimes it's hospitality, friendship, whatever. Because very often the married people just live in their married connections with other married people, and the single people miss out. There is a song which I think, the lyrics of it I hate almost more than any other. It's a very old one. You older people will know it. And you know that song, with someone like you, a pal good and true, I'd like to leave the world behind and go and find blah, blah, blah. And then it goes on and says, we'll build a sweet little nest somewhere in the west and let the rest of the world go by. And that is what I hate. We'll build a sweet little nest somewhere in the west and let the rest of the world go by. And I think for those of us who are married, our marriage, our family situation, our relationships can also be a gift to those who are single. And I think that there is a huge challenge which faces us all to really be Christian communities today. To be Christian communities in an individualistic world, and to be Christian communities embracing others in a world which is steeped in loneliness. So we're going to have a final song, which is Brother, Sister, Let Me Serve You.